At 12:28 a.m. on May 17, 1943, Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood pushed the yoke of his stripped-down Lancaster bomber forward, diving toward the black surface of the Merhin Reservoir at 240 miles per hour. He was flying at 60 feet lower than the pine trees surrounding the valley. Hanging beneath the belly of his aircraft was a weapon that violated three fundamental laws of aerial ballistics. It wasn't pointed at the ground. It was a 9,250-pound steel cylinder spinning backwards at 500 revolutions per minute, screaming like a mechanical banshee over the roar of the engines. In the next 30 seconds, Hopgood would be incinerated by the 20mm flak cannons mounted on the dam towers. But the cylinder he dropped would skip across the water jump over a double layer of steel torpedo nets and prove that a 55-year-old eccentric civilian who had left school at 16 to work in a shipyard understood the physics of destruction better than the entire British Admiralty. The weapon didn't exist in any Royal Air Force manual. It had no fins, no guidance system, and looked more like a garbage can than a munition. Yet it was the only thing on Earth capable of cracking a masonry wall 100 feet thick, and it existed only because Barnes Wallis spent his weekends throwing marbles into a tub of water in his backyard, obsessing over a problem that military experts said was unsolvable. Barnes Wallis wasn't a soldier. He was a structural engineer from Derbyshire who learned his trade in the chaotic, noisy workshops of Vickers smelling of grease and pipe tobacco. His mind didn't process war in terms of tactics or territory. He processed it in terms of fluid dynamics and structural stress. When the war started, he looked at the German dams in the Ruhr Valley and didn't see fortresses. He saw static gravity structures. He knew that the water pressing against the Merhin Dam weighed 130 million tons. He knew that if he could detonate an explosive deep underwater right against the wall, the water itself would act like a solid steel piston. It would transfer the shockwave into the masonry with 100% efficiency, shattering it from the inside. But there was a problem that defied conventional military logic. The Germans knew the dams were vulnerable. They had installed heavy anti-torpedo nets in the water to stop underwater attacks. They had heavy flak guns to stop high-altitude bombers. To break the dam, you needed a bomb that could travel over the water to avoid the nets but stop dead at the wall to sink to the bottom. It was a physical paradox. You needed a projectile that acted like a skipping stone but weighed as much as a truck. The Army engineers told Wallis to give up. They said steel cannot withstand that impact. If you drop a 4-ton casing at 200 miles per hour, it will shatter like glass. Wallis ignored the experts. He went back to his garden tub. He catapulted marbles across the water and noticed something crucial. If a sphere had backspin spinning opposite to its direction of travel, it didn't just bounce better, it created aerodynamic lift. This was the Magnus Effect. The spinning marbles trapped a layer of air, pulling them upward, allowing them to glide over the water rather than diving into it. But more importantly, the spin turned the object into a gyroscope. It refused to tumble. It hit the water flat every time. Wallis calculated that if he spun a 4-ton drum at exactly 500 RPM backwards, the centrifugal force would stabilize the steel casing, preventing it from shattering. He wasn't building a bomb, he was building a high-speed stone that could hurdle German defenses. But when he proposed it, the Air Ministry called it Wallis's silly ball. They refused to give him planes. They refused to give him steel. He had to steal materials from other projects just to build a prototype. By May 1943, the weapon was ready, but the delivery method was suicidal. To make the physics work, the bomb had to be dropped from exactly 60 feet. Standard altimeters had a margin of error of 50 feet. If a pilot trusted his instruments, he would fly straight into the dark water. Wallis solved this not with advanced radar, but with a trick from theater lighting. He mounted 2 spotlights on the belly of the plane, angled to intersect on the ground exactly at 60 feet. When the 2 dots of light merged into a figure 8 on the water, the pilot was at the kill height. It was simple, effective, and deadly because it lit up the bomber like a Christmas tree for every German gunner in the valley. To carry the weapon, the RAF had to butcher their best bombers. The Avro Lancaster was a heavy lifter, but the upkeep bomb was too big for the bay. Engineers cut the belly of the plane open. They removed the armor plating protecting the pilot to save weight. They removed the top gun turrets. The crews of the 617 Squadron were flying skeleton planes. They were essentially flying a giant gas tank with a spinning flywheel underneath. Inside the cockpit, the vibration was unbearable. The hydraulic motor used to spin the bomb shook the airframe so violently that the pilot's hands went numb on the yoke. On the night of May 16th, as they crossed the Dutch coast at tree-top level, they realized the true cost of Wallis's invention. They were flying so low that they were taking fire not just from anti-aircraft guns, but from soldiers with rifles. One plane hit the electrical power lines, tearing the wing off and cartwheeling into a fireball. Another hit the water and bounced off, losing its bomb. By the time they reached the Merhen Dam, they had already lost men, and then Hopgood began his run. He turned on the spotlights. The beams cut through the darkness. The German gunners on the towers didn't need radar, they just aimed between the lights. Hopgood held the line. His fuel tank caught fire. He was trailing a 100-foot plume of flame. He knew he was dead. But he also knew that if he dropped the bomb at the wrong angle, the physics would fail. He waited 600 yards, 500 yards. The lights merged. He pressed the release. The 4-ton cylinder dropped. The cylinder hit the black water at 240 miles per hour. For a split second, the surface tension threatened to rip the steel casing apart like wet paper, but Barnes-Wallis's backyard experiments held true. The backspin kicked in. The cylinder kissed the surface, threw up a massive spray of white foam, and leaped into the air. It traveled 400 yards in 3 skips, clearing the double layer of anti-torpedo nets with feet to spare. It slammed into the concrete face of the dam with a dull thud. And this is where the genius of the shipyard engineer defeated the might of Nazi architecture. A normal bomb would have bounced off the wall and exploded harmlessly on the surface. But because the drum was spinning backwards, it grabbed the wet concrete like a tire gripping the road. It didn't bounce away, it crawled down. It clung to the masonry, rolling down into the depths until it triggered the hydrostatic fuse at exactly 30 feet. The explosion didn't push the wall over, it shattered it from the inside. 6,000 pounds of Torpex detonated against the stone. Water is incompressible. It cannot shrink. So when the bomb exploded, the water acted like a solid steel piston, transferring 100% of the shockwave directly into the masonry. This was the water hammer effect Wallis had predicted. Hopgood never saw it. His plane, already trailing fire, was caught in the blast plume of the preceding bomb. The wing snapped off. The Lancaster cartwheeled into the ground 2 miles downstream, killing everyone on board. Hopgood died so that the physics could work, but the dam held. It took 3 more runs, 3 more spinning drums. Finally, pilot David Maltby dropped the 4th bomb. It was perfect. As Gibson flew alongside to draw fire, he saw the dam wall groan. A crack thin as a spiderweb appeared in the center. Then the hydrostatic pressure of 130 million tons of water found that weakness. It pushed. The stone gave way. A hole 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep opened up. The lake didn't just leak, it punched through. The water hit the valley floor with the kinetic energy of an atomic bomb. The power station at the base of the dam, a massive brick structure, was erased in 4 seconds. It didn't collapse, it simply ceased to exist. Downstream, the sirens didn't sound in time. The flood wave, moving at 30 miles per hour, was a slurry of mud, trees, and jagged pieces of masonry. It hit the villages of Neheim and Houston while civilians slept. But the true horror happened in the forced labor camps. Thousands of Russian and Polish prisoners enslaved by the Nazi machine to work the coal mines were sleeping in wooden barracks directly in the flood path. They had no chance. The water didn't just drown them, it crushed them. The debris field acted like a grinder. This is the dark paradox of the raid. The weapon designed to stop tyranny ended up killing the very people it was meant to liberate. 1,600 people died that night. More than half were Allied prisoners. The bouncing bomb was a technical marvel, but on the ground it was a blunt instrument of mass death. But the mission wasn't over. The Merhen was gone, but the Eder Dam was still standing. And the Eder presented a challenge that wasn't about flak or fighters, it was about topography. If the Merhen was a fortress, the Eder was a trap. It was hidden deep in a winding valley surrounded by 1,000-foot hills. There was no long approach. To hit it, a pilot had to perform a maneuver that no heavy bomber was ever designed to do. They had to dive over a castle on a steep hill, drop like a stone into the valley, pull the nose up at the last second to reach 60 feet, release the bomb, and then immediately bank 90 degrees to avoid smashing into the granite cliff on the other side. They had a 7-second window to execute the dive. Pilot after pilot tried. They dove into the hole, but the physics of a 30-ton bomber fought them. The speed picked up too fast in the dive. If they dropped the bomb at that speed, the casing would shatter. If they slowed down, the plane would stall and crash. Pilot Shannon made 6 attempts. He was sweating, cursing, wrestling the yoke with both hands. The air in the valley was turbulent, tossing the massive planes around like paper kites. Finally, Australian pilot Les Knight found the line. He cut the throttle, dropped the flaps to create drag and dove. He leveled out for exactly 3 seconds. The spotlights touched. Bomb gone. He pulled the yoke into his stomach. The Lancaster groaned, straining every rivet, and barely cleared the mountain peak. Behind him, the bomb skipped. It hit the Eder, the dam which had no anti-torpedo nets because the Germans thought an attack was impossible, crumbled. The largest reservoir in Germany was empty by sunrise. The flight home was a massacre. The Germans were awake now. Every searchlight in the Ruhr was hunting for them. The pilots flew at tree-top level, so low they had to pull up to jump over hedgerows. Pilot Bill Otley was hit over the coast. His plane turned into a fireball. His last words over the radio were, "I'm sorry, boys, we've had it." Pilot Henry Maudslay, who had dropped his bomb too late and damaged his own plane in the explosion, was shot down just miles from the border. Of the 19 Lancasters that took off, 8 never came back. 53 men, the cream of the RAF, were dead. When Guy Gibson landed at Scampton at 4 a.m., he didn't cheer. He walked into the mess hall and saw the empty chairs. Bacon and eggs were served for 133 men. Only 80 came to eat. Barnes Wallis was waiting for them. When he heard the casualty numbers, the man who had spent his life building airships and playing with marbles broke down. He wasn't a military man. He hadn't built a tolerance for death. He wept openly, saying, "I killed them. I killed those boys." He offered to resign. The Air Ministry refused. They told him, "You didn't kill them, Mr. Wallis. You gave them away to matter." When the sun rose on May 17th, the Ruhr Valley wasn't just flooded, it was paralyzed. The water level in the reservoirs dropped by 75%. This didn't just mean wet basements. It meant the steelworks in Essen lost their cooling water. It meant the coal mines were filled with millions of tons of sludge. For 2 weeks, the heartbeat of the Nazi war machine skipped a beat. But the Germans were masters of logistics. They pulled 7,000 men from the Atlantic Wall soldiers who should have been building bunkers to stop the D-Day invasion and sent them to fix the dams. They rebuilt the walls in just 4 months. Strategically, the raid was a temporary setback, but psychologically it was an earthquake. It proved that the British could invent a weapon that defied physics and deliver it into the most heavily defended valley on Earth. It forced the Nazis to move thousands of anti-aircraft guns from the front lines to protect Germany's interior, leaving their armies exposed. Barnes Wallis never celebrated. While the pilots were given medals and the newspapers called it a triumph, Wallis sat in his office at Vickers staring at the list of the dead. 53 young men. He had designed the bomb to destroy concrete, but the cost of that concrete was flesh and blood. He felt personally responsible for every empty chair in the mess hall. He didn't retire. He didn't go on a speaking tour. He did what a blue-collar genius always does. He went back to the drawing board to fix the problem. The problem was that low-level bombing was suicide. So he spent the rest of the war designing a new class of weapon, the earthquake bomb. He created the tall boy and the grand slam. These weren't skipping stones. They were aerodynamic darts designed to be dropped from 20,000 feet. They hit the ground at supersonic speeds, burrowing 100 feet into the earth before exploding. They created a camouflage, an underground cavern that collapsed foundations without ever putting a pilot within range of a flak gun. Wallis spent the rest of the war saving the lives of the men he sent into battle. He worked until he was an old man. When the British government awarded him £10,000 for his invention, he refused to keep it. He donated the entire sum to the RAF Benevolent Fund to pay for the education of the children whose fathers died carrying his spinning drums. He never kept a penny. When he died in 1979, his gravestone didn't mention the dams. It didn't mention the knighthood. It was simple, just like the man who preferred his garden tub to the war room. Today the Merhen Dam stands quiet. The water is calm. But if you look closely at the masonry, you can see the scar. The stones in the center are a different color, lighter, newer, marking the exact spot where the spinning drum punched through. The men of the 617 Squadron are gone. Guy Gibson, the leader who flew at 60 feet with the death lights on, was killed in action just a year later. But the legacy of that night remains. It isn't just a story about a bomb. It's a story about the intersection of desperation and innovation. It's about a shipyard worker who looked at a child skipping stones and saw a way to stop a war. And it's about the boys who trusted his math enough to fly into the dark armed with nothing but a flashlight and a spinning metal drum. They proved that when the manual says impossible, you don't turn back. You change the manual.